Today we have Lisa Osborne, who is Black Public Media's Director of Emerging Media, and she's really on a mission to make more VR, AR, AI more accessible to Black creators, and really train them, which is what she's going to talk about today. I think her career kind of mirrors the rise of digital media. She graduated from Northwestern with a journalism degree and did not have an email address, like many of us at that time. And she worked in newspapers and book publishing, and then helped launch Turner's first online content startup. This completely changed her worldview and her career. She went, as she says, from print to digital and from editor to producer. She moved to Germany and ran Adidas.com and was their first internet hire, full-time internet hire, and then was at the American Film Institute's incubator in Los Angeles and produced digital prototypes for NBC, MTV, Cartoon Network. I'm glad to see they were doing digital. PBS, and frequently collaborated with Sundance, and that's where I met you first, back in 2013.
Yeah.
You produced our panel.
Right.
It was awesome, and was introduced to VR there. She also has created and taught a class at Carnegie Mellon University. So,
Thank you.
Lisa.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Even though I'll be droning on down here, please, if you want to interject a comment or a question, just pop your hand up so I know, and I'll pause and we can have a chat. I would like it to be very conversational and less lectury. The arc of the presentation is basically I'm going to talk about what's a gatekeeper, then I'm going to talk about who's Black Public Media, our plan regarding emerging media and increasing the number of Black creatives in that space. Then we'll talk about some challenges that I've faced and in terms of implementing some kind of emerging media educational program. And then we'll jump back to concrete examples of what we've managed to accomplish since we kicked off in April of this year. So we're like, about 6 months into our strategy. What are you showing me? Oh, okay.
Sorry, you need an app. It's an app.
I was like, oh, is that super easy? So I guess definition of terms first. What is a gatekeeper? I think it's a term that's thrown around, but we don't really think it through a lot because we don't really have any real necessity to actually think about what's a gatekeeper. This year has managed to completely transform the way I think about gatekeeping and who has access to things. I think normally when you think about gatekeeping, you think about somebody who stands between a group of people or an individual and their desired object of their desire, right? So whether that's a piece of content, it's training, it's funding. Usually when we think of stuff like that, it's a curatorial, perspective. Like what filters are they using to determine what gets placed in a conference or a festival or something like that. And as we go through, I mean, what I'd like to, hopefully the presentation will highlight is that gatekeeping happens at so many levels and in so many ways that sort of end up unintentionally creating barriers to entry for underrepresented organizations and people. And so it's like little small decisions that you make about really tiny things or things that should be tiny but then end up being actually creating hurdles that are unnecessary. So a gatekeeper provides training, they provide funding, they grant access to information, instruction, spaces, content, interviews, like they determine who gets to interview for that internship or that job, auditions, groups, as in professional networking organizations or union organizations, equipment and events. They also provide distribution or exhibition for either content or information. So the more prized the training, the funding, the access to distribution, basically the more prestigious the gatekeeper ends up being. So that leads us to ask, well, is Black Public Media a gatekeeper? And as I went down my own list, I was like, Yeah, of course we are. Do we provide training? Yeah. Do we provide funding? Absolutely. That's the whole purpose of our organization being created. Do we provide access to spaces? No, we don't run any venues. Do we provide access to grant access to content? No, we do not. We're not an intermediary. We don't sell content. We're not a platform. Do we grant access to interviews? No, not currently. Auditions? No. Access to certain groups? Absolutely. Access to equipment? Now that we've started doing stuff with VR? Yes. Access to events? Absolutely. Do we distribute content? We do not now. In the earliest inception of the organization, it did. They actually used to actively distribute educational DVDs in the educational market, but when that market kind of, they, abandoned that and have not picked it back up. But it's something that our executive director is really interested in finding a solution for, or finding updated options. Do we provide exhibition? Yes, we have an original anthology series called Afropop that we distribute via the World Channel, and it's now, this past year was its 10th season, so the 11th season will start in, I guess, Q1 or Q2 of next year. And the World Channel is run by American Public Television. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of American Public Television. Okay.
Have you heard of GBH?
And so,
Do you want to try with this one?
yeah. So anyway,
On my phone?
it's
That phone
a
doesn't
digital
work.
distribution. I think a lot of people in the US aren't aware that there are other options aside from just PBS to distribute your content if you're a public media maker. APT is one of those options. And so we provide distribution in terms of the content that we curate for our anthology series, whether it's 1 hour long docs or shorts. Usually we do at least one episode that's entirely comprised of shorts. That's a way for us to provide exhibition, but we ourselves are not a distributor. Does anybody have any questions so far? Nope. Why do gatekeepers matter? Gatekeepers matter because they have influence on who gets the training, who gets the funding, who gets to tell stories, and which stories get told. And the end result of that is that gatekeepers end up having a tangible and material impact on what I call culture creation, even when the gatekeeper is not actually in the culture creation business. So even if the company is not a content company per se, or a distribution company per se, they end up impacting by their decisions about who gets that interview, the shortlist to be a PA, who gets an interview to be the junior designer, who gets to get the opportunity to shadow a director or shadow a creative director in an art department. All those things have a ripple effect, so that even if you are a software company or a hardware company, you end up having a really material impact on who actually gets to tell stories in our culture and actually gets to create our culture. Black Public Media is a 40-year-old film nonprofit. We were created by Corporation Public Broadcasting, who is still our primary funder. We are one of 5 minority consortia that exist in the US. The 4 other organizations focus on Latino Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Pacific Islanders. They are based in Nebraska, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Hawaii, and Black Public Media was originally started in Ohio, but has been based in Harlem for, I don't know, like 15, 20 years now at this point. The purpose of the minority consortia is to help American public television look more like America. That's like my little short log line for that. When you turn on PBS, this is not going to be a dig at PBS, this is my commentary on when you look at content options, period. Next time you open your Netflix screen, your Netflix app, your Amazon app, or PBS, I want you to go 5 screens deep, and I want you to count how many leads of color are actually in the thumbnail images. Like, that's a quick empirical way to just see who gets funded, whose stories get funded, who gets centered as the hero of the story. You see what I'm saying? And then when you dig down in each of those projects or productions, each of those employs anywhere from 50 to probably 150 people. you know, so there's like a whole cottage industry. They're like startup businesses or standalone businesses by themselves. And so when you look at who's on those crews, telling the stories of who was in the thumbnail image that you flip through when you were on a plane or on your tablet or whatever, you start to understand what I'm talking about in terms of like the ripple effect of the decisions of who gets funded, who, you know, the decisions that gatekeepers make every single day without really thinking about long-term effects, especially gatekeepers who are not, as I said, actual culture, don't consider themselves to be part of the culture creation business, but they have a direct impact on that business. For anybody who's tweeting, our Twitter handle is not actually Black Public Media, it's BLK because of the character limit. So just wanted to give y'all a heads up on that. In terms of funding, we've funded about 200 projects at this point. We have several mechanisms for funding. One of them is a rolling open call that you can submit, you know, your application whenever you want. We call it the discretionary fund, and basically it's a couple of times a year we'll all read, you know, watch and read people's work samples and read their applications and, you know, vigorously debate the merits of each project and then determine, you know, how much money the project is going to get, if anything, for. We tend to give people development funds and finishing funds. We don't really give production funds that often, simply because we don't have the budgets compared to other organizations in the public media space. So other organizations can easily cut a check for $100,000, $200,000 to give somebody production money. We really prioritize when it comes to Black filmmakers on helping them do development, like getting that pitch reel made or getting a sizzle reel made, which might be really challenging for them, even if it only costs $25,000 or $15,000, and doing the finishing. So it's like they might raise their production money, shoot the thing, and then they don't have the money for the sound mix or to pay for the archival footage or whatever. About 80% of our content is nonfiction, it's documentary work. So our production budgets range from $300K to $1.5 million for broadcast films and $20 to $100K for digital series. Black Public Media was one of the first public media organizations in the country to actually start creating web series and funding them actively and actively soliciting them from makers. What else? We award $25,000 to $100,000 grants. $100,000 is about our cap, basically. And if you want a full list of projects, which is totally not up to date, that's the URL right there. It's blackpublicmedia.org/projects. Here are some sample filmmakers that we have supported over the years. We really like to, you know, meet somebody when they're emerging, and basically as their work evolves, as their maturity level as a storyteller and filmmaker evolves, like stick with them over the course of, you know, a decade, 15 years, etc. Probably the best known example of that is probably Stanley Nelson, who, you know, has directed things like Freedom Writers and Marcus Garvey, Look for Me in the Whirlwind, and The Murder of Emmett Till. Most recently, we funded Angela Tucker's short called All Skinfolk Ain't Kinfolk, which is a documentary about the New Orleans mayoral runoff, the race between two. It was historic because it was the first time that two women were in the runoff for it to be the mayor of New Orleans, and also the first time that two Black women were up to be the mayor of New Orleans, because I think the city's had, I don't know, maybe like 4 to 6 Black mayors already who are all men, but never a woman. Byron Hurt is another one. Melissa Hazlip, who's been traveling the country since April, screening Mr. Soul, which is a documentary about her uncle who ran a TV show on PBS that was really instrumental, sort of, you know, basically the plot of the show was Blackness, and he curated it with the other producers to just showcase the best of Black culture at the time. It was a pretty short-lived show, but apparently it just had like a humongous influence on the culture, because, you know, one night you would have, you know, Patti LaBelle, the next night you'd have, you know, Nikki Giovanni reciting a poem. Like, it was just this crazy sort of mix that you don't really see on television anymore. So Michele Stephenson and Joe Brewster, they did a documentary called American Promise about their kids basically attending school, and it was 2 black boys, their son and one other child. It was a really great documentary. She's actually working on a VR piece right now.
With our lab.
Oh, there we go. So, Thomas Allen Harris, who I know spoke here earlier this year, I believe, or was it last year?
Yeah.
It was this year, yeah. So he's working on family pictures for PBS, which is a project he's been working on forever. So it's awesome to see it finally become an actual thing. Our frequent distribution partners are American Public Television, American Experience, Independent Lens, World Channel, PBS, POV, and then of course our own show, Afropop. So in terms of our VR mission, basically the mission is to lower barriers to entry. It's kind of like increase participation of Black creatives and do that by lowering barriers to entry. When I took the job in February, I had been an independent consultant for about 9 years, and before that I had done the job of being the head of production at American Film Institute's incubator for about 3 years. During the time that I was an independent consultant, I programmed New Frontiers tech panels during the festival for 6 festivals. So I stayed really, after the AFI experience, which was my first introduction to working on experimental media. I continued to work on experimental media basically through my relationship with Sundance. All the stuff that Shari programmed into New Frontiers, super weird and awesome, and was an education every year. It was an opportunity to see things years before it would actually turn into something tangible like a startup or an app or, a device. So what I discovered in February, March, and a little bit in April when I was sort of doing an unofficial listening tour, I was talking to everybody, and I was talking to a lot of Black people in tech. And the things I heard will be picked up later in this presentation, but basically I realized I had to throw out my whole plan that I'd planned to do, the idea I had pitched the executive director of the organization to get the job. I was like, Leslie, my whole idea actually doesn't make any sense. I have to go back to the drawing board. So originally I thought that I would basically return to Los Angeles from Atlanta where I live, and take advantage of all those Sundance and AFI and LA relationships and basically go knock on Nani's door and Chris Milk's door and all these people's doors and say, hey, I need to negotiate internships and shadowing opportunities and, all those types of normal things with your company. And I thought that's what I would spend my time doing, and that we would also start funding VR pretty much immediately, because that's the type of thing that Black public media specializes in, is funding filmmakers. And what I discovered during my 2 months of talking to Black people was that basically not enough Black people have seen VR for me to actually set up immediately those type of programs, because it's just way too premature. And that was really shocking to me, because again, I had been living in a bubble, I realized, on the West Coast and specifically in LA, working at that intersection of entertainment and tech, which I didn't know I was living in a bubble. I mean, but being in Atlanta, it was a strange mix of things were happening. Like, on the one hand, the phone calls were really fascinating, but then really frustrating. And at the same time, I went to an AI talk, because I started checking out Atlanta's tech scene, and I went to an AI talk, and it was at a room at Georgia Tech. And I remember I walked in and I was like, wow, there's a lot of Black people here. And the definition of a lot when you go to a thing and there is when there's more than 3 Black people, whether it's 20 people at the event or there's 200. If there's more than 3 Black people, that's a lot. And that was what I'd grown used to in 25 years of tech, since my first tech job in '95 at Turner. And at that point, I had lived overseas and, been in tech. Why is it trying to sign in Sarah on Chrome? It misses you.
Stop there. Stop. Okay, if you click on that.
There we go. So anyway, I walk into this AI talk, and they were handing around like a check-in app, like an attendance thing, and I saw that it was like already over 100 people. I think it was like 116 or something. Oh, it's over here. Sorry, I'm talking to myself. And I could hear the voice of the speaker, and I was like, oh, I can't see anything. And then finally I saw the speaker, and the speaker was black, and I almost fell out of my chair. I was like, oh my God, you can't be the speaker, you're black. Because that had never, ever, ever happened to me in Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Like, not once, okay? I worked for Adidas in Portland. I worked for old school interactive television company that predates TiVo in the Bay Area in like 99, 2000. I then moved to LA, you know, where I spent 9 years, and I had never organically gone to a random event and had a black speaker talking about any emerging tech subject. Not once. So not only was the speaker black, but 10% of the people in the room were black. So that it was already like, woo, this is a lot of people. And I was trying to understand, like, okay, so if there's so many black people in this room and the speaker's black, like, where are they in VR and AR? Because when I'm at these festivals, I'm not seeing a lot of black attendees, nor am I seeing a lot of work that's being created. And again, I understand this gatekeeper issue. So this, you know, is what's starting now in my head is like, well, where are they? Because clearly people, at least in Atlanta, are earning tech degrees, quite a lot of them. So where are they in the content industries? You know, like what happens? Are they all getting like hoovered up into like the bowels of Delta IT department and, you know, Georgia Pacific and Intercontinental Hotels and all the other big Atlanta companies? I have no idea. But it was just really, it triggered a whole bunch of things on top of the conversations I've been having that basically, can someone do this? Oh, there we go. Who's a Mac person? Jeez. So I had to throw out my strategy is my point. So voila, here's the new strategy. The new strategy is the number one priority is exposure. Expose more black people to VR. It's very simple. And so the way you do that is you take VR, you take the VR, both the headsets and the content, to black spaces and black events when possible. So then you basically, as a gatekeeper, my role becomes, well, which black spaces and which black events and which content am I taking to show them? Like if I'm going to show somebody a feature film for the very first time, like think back to when you saw your first movie at age 3, 4, 5. And think about all the issues that we now know about representation and lack of representation and the ripple effects that has on our culture. If I could show every single person a feature film that actually had somebody in the lead that looked like them, think what impact that would have on that person if like the first 10, 15, 20 feature films they saw actually had people that looked like them, that had roles that were not garbage and that weren't 2D, but that were actually interesting, three-dimensional, robust characters, you know? So as a curator, now then imagine, okay, I have to find black VR to show black people, and what does black VR even mean? Is it that it's made by a black person? Is it that there's a lead black person on the lead creative team? Is it that it's about black people? You know, like what exactly is black VR? Because no one ever asked what white VR is, because white VR is just VR, you know? Phase 2 will be equipment and training. So I figure about by fall of next year, I will figure out a way to start to offer some sort of class for people in New York City. So the example I've been giving is that let's say there's a stitching class or something like that for there's 10 spots. I, as the gatekeeper organization, might say, I'm gonna buy 3 of those spots and I'm gonna deeply subsidize them by 75 to 90% to lower barriers to entry. And then I'm gonna do either a contest or some sort of application process to find the 3 people to take those slots in the seat. And so I then would have done my job as a gatekeeper, and I would have fulfilled my mission of reducing barriers to entry by helping black people get into spaces that normally are beyond their reach. And then phase 3 will be what we normally do, which is funding. I just don't think we've started to license a few things. We have not given money to anybody for an original production yet. Just this past week, we decided we're going to beta test adding 2 VR projects to our incubator. We have a filmmaker incubator called the 360 Incubator, which is kind of an unfortunate name now that we're adding VR slots. It gets very confusing, but we're going to add 2 secret VR projects. I mean, we're going to announce them in a press release, so they're not going to be secret anymore, but it wasn't a public call for submissions because we didn't want to deal with that when we're just trying to find 2 beta testers, basically. And the 2 projects we picked are both probably 80 to 90% complete, or at least their shoots are complete. The VRs themselves have not been completed. One of them is probably 80 or 90% through post. Her project is going to be finished by the end of January. And the other project, he needs to raise money to do post, but his shoot is complete. So the idea that we offered them is we can help you incubate your community engagement plan. Again, in our mission as a public media organization, this is not about incubating your marketing plan or your publicity plan. It's about your community engagement plan. And the thing that we noticed on a lot of the applications is that filmmakers don't really, because they've never done this before, they don't really understand that fuzzy line between a PR and a marketing plan and community engagement. You know, community engagement is like workshops. It's, you know, screenings and talks and things like that. It's trying to figure out if there's an educational thread in your piece, you know, especially if it's nonfiction. One of the projects we picked is fiction, the other one is nonfiction. What can we break that out into in terms of bringing it into communities, especially communities of color, and specifically Black communities, to expose them to VR through these pieces. So we'll see what happens. That incubator kicks off in January and wraps in April at a event we throw called Pitch Black, which this will be the 3rd time we're throwing it. And basically the makers who go through the incubator get the chance to pitch for money to make their sizzle reel or their trailer or their pilot. And in the case of the 2 VR projects, they'll get to pitch for the money to execute their community engagement campaign. So they would have used the incubator to basically design and research a community engagement plan for their project from January to April. Any questions so far about Black public media, what we're doing? No comments? No? Okay.
Wait, there's one.
Oh, I can't see. Oh, hi.
Hi. That's my name. Okay. I'm Ralph from Nova. We emailed earlier.
Oh, hi.
But I guess one question I do have is sort of in what ways do you see sort of the technology itself around VR being competitive towards engagement? And do you see that you had to perhaps prioritize AR over VR, just given the fact that technology is generally more accessible since everybody sort of has a smartphone now?
That's a question that comes up pretty regularly. They're like, why aren't you just prioritizing AR? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Have you shown filmmakers AR stuff? I feel like VR is low-hanging fruit out of the 3 buckets, VR, AR, and AI. Like, when filmmakers see VR, they immediately understand, they understand their role in it. You see what I'm saying? Whether they're a writer, a DP, a director, it's like they can see a path forward of, oh, I can do this, but about this, you know, or I'd love to try this because then I would like to try to do it this way. When I've watched people use AR, I don't see that sort of immediate sense of ownership or intuitive understanding of the medium, where they can say, oh, I want to do this, or why'd they shoot it that way? I'd do it this way. I feel like the visual language is so different in AR that that in and of itself becomes a barrier. And I just don't have the resources. My department is 1.5 people, and our company is 6 full-time staffers and 1 full-time contractor. So we just don't have a team that I wish I could have like an AR manager, you know, who then would focus on just AR education, but I just don't have the bandwidth, yeah. Does that answer make sense for you in terms of the visual language and low-hanging fruit? Okay, all right, cool.
And to add to that, what about AI? Where are you with that?
I'll probably do 1 AI thing a year. I just had Stephanie Dinkins come talk, and she's so dope and her work is so interesting. It's like, what makes a black AI? Is it the color of the casing? Is it the color, you know, is it because, does it have to be based on real people to be black? Like, I think, you know, the project that she's doing in terms of, Stephanie Dinkins is an artist in New York who's creating an AI based on 3 women in her family, including herself, and they're all 30 years apart, so it's like 3 generations of her family, and so it's like part documentary, part fiction, you know, algorithmically generated fiction, and part family memoir. So it's like, how do you know, it's just an amazing concept. So I would love to feature somebody like her even once a year in our programming lineup, just to expose people.
Right, and do you see, I mean, you said you don't see people understand how to use VR very intuitively,
Yeah.
filmmakers.
Yeah.
Do you see that for AI?
I do not. I think they think it's a personal butler.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it runs your house, it's a personal assistant on your phone. I don't think they intuitively grasp that you can use it to tell stories or do what Stephanie's doing, which is very high concept, you know what I mean? And again, that all goes back to phase 1, which is lack of exposure. You know, the more that they get exposed to AI, I don't know, 5 years from now, when we finish our VR mission and we have 3 more staffers, then yes, I would love to start showing them more AI stuff.
Yeah, just a quick question. When you say VR, what technologies do you mean? We use a bunch of it here. It's a fast-changing
Right.
technology. Do you mean 360, or are you using more?
All of it. It's an umbrella term because
LiDAR-based photogrammetry
in
works.
game engine, no game engine, I don't care, because when the audience has no exposure to it at all, they just need a catch-all term, you know? So like, when we do our pop-up VR theaters, I don't even get into trying to explain the difference between 360 versus game engine run versus like room scale VR. Like I'm merely trying to expose them to the medium, period, to start with. That's it. Yeah. Yep.
Can you repeat the name of that artist with the
Stephanie Dinkins. Yeah. So our target audience, after our half a year of work, this is where we've settled for next year. I have ruled that students are out of scope. We did a couple of really awesome high school events. We had a bunch of college-age people roll through a bunch of our events. They're out of scope. We just don't have the bandwidth. Also, Black Public Media itself doesn't focus on student filmmakers. We focus on people who are, you know, adults. My number 1 target audience is millennials, because frighteningly, millennials are now as old as age 36. Which is terrifying. Basically, that's a person who's in the first decade of their career. They have 0 to few credits, and they probably have 1 primary job or multiple survival jobs. That's what I'm finding, at least in like the New York and LA ecosystems, as I talk to young makers who are like 3, 4, 5 years out of school. In terms of Gen X, I had to split them into 2 groups. So Gen X A is basically 10 to 25 years into their career. They have few to extensive credits, so at this point they've gotten over the I have 0 credits, now they have at least a few. And what I'm finding, at least in the Black filmmaking community, is that they tend to have multiple jobs, like 2 to 3. So they might be a professor, but they're also like producing their play, which is a concrete person that I have in here just to show you real world examples. And then Gen X B, that's basically people who are at like the top 5% of their profession. They no longer have to have multiple jobs to survive, and they are famous for their actual creative job, and they are solidly booked for their actual creative job. I would love to reach more of those people, but they are incredibly difficult to reach. So because I'd like those people to become executive producers to the Black makers who are already working in VR, and attach their name to their projects to help open doors for them. So this is Danielle Pruitt. She was on a panel with me last night at the Apollo Theater. She is a senior associate producer at MTV. She majored in film and environmental studies at Wesleyan. I said to her, that's unusual. Wesleyan's not really a film school. And she yeah, exactly. She was like, that is not right, Lisa. And she she rapidly corrected me about that. She's been shooting VR for about 2 years. She got no exposure to it in college at all, and which I find shocking since she's 25. I'm like, how did that happen, Wesleyan? That's a little bit odd. Basically, she got exposed to it when she went to Tribeca, I believe she said, after college, and she said she just fell in love with it. She was like, this is so cool. And then she had another friend, another fellow Wesleyan graduate, who started actually shooting some, also became interested in it, and they started shooting marches. So this was basically Trump's election triggered them to becoming VR filmmakers. They started attending the big marches. So they went to Charlottesville, they went to the Women's March, they went to a bunch of different marches, probably like 5 to 6. And just, they invested in buying a low-end VR camera, and away they went. Zero training, except her film training. Her creative partner, her first one, he is not a filmmaker, he's an activist. So it's like he's the one who sort of, picks like where they're going and stuff like that. Now they're a 3-person crew, and so another film major from Wesleyan has come on board as their third partner. And they've renamed the project Activism in Full View, and the idea now is that they have one episode, the first episode of 3, and that episode 1 focuses on all the marches that they shot early this year, or 2 years ago. And that episode 2 would focus on, episode 2 is supposed to focus on, I think, immigration, and then episode 3 is supposed to focus on cash bail, I believe. So that's Danielle. In the last 2 years, she has spent $6,150 on VR equipment because, she got passionate about it, and that's what you do if you're an indie filmmaker or any other kind of, if you're any other kind of maker, you do the same thing. Her biggest purchase was buying a Mac to edit on because of their inability to find publicly accessible edit suites in New York City for them to edit their VR on. Second example of a millennial is Ashley Backus-Clark, who is visiting artist here with Hyphen Labs at MIT. She was also on the panel last night at the Apollo. Her official title is Director of Research at Hyphen Labs. She has an undergraduate degree in molecular biology, and a grad degree in also in basically molecular biology. And she was doing stem cell research right after college, and was always like the only black face in the hallway, she says. And it was just a very lonely profession for her to be in. But she had always had an interest in writing, she revealed last night during the panel, which I did not realize that. And so she had this tug of war the whole time she was in undergrad, and then even when she went to get her master's and she was about to go start a PhD program. I was like, Ashley, what are you doing? So Hyphen Labs is a really small studio. It's probably 3 principals, and then they have like a collective of talent that they work with depending on what the project is. They do both commercial work as well as their original productions. And so how I met them was at Sundance in 2017 when they debuted a 5-minute sci-fi piece called Neurospeculative Afrofeminism. Has anybody in this room watched that film? Oh, okay, cool. And I have it on headsets here for anybody who wants to see it. I brought 2 headsets. So, and it's also on the Oculus store if you have your own headset. And then their next project is Encrypted, which is the episode 2 of Neurospeculative. So it was a $200,000 budget, original IP. After it debuted at Sundance, they just kind of did the festival circuit. They took it to Tribeca, they went to South by. And now they're at a point 3 years later, because they built it in 2016, debuted it in 2017, took it everywhere all of 2017, now it's 2018. So it's like, it's really time for them to kick out whatever the next piece of content or next original piece of content they're gonna do. It's about that time. So this is Laurel. He's a writer-director. He's an adjunct professor at Sarah Lawrence, and he's the one who's working on the world premiere of a play that he wrote called Awake, which will debut in an off-Broadway theater called the Barrow Group in Q1 of next year. And so this is what I mean by multiple income streams. Like, you know, your day job is you teach at Sarah Lawrence, but you're also like working on your production for months at a time, you know, to get it ready for its debut. And he has, as you see, a quite extensive resume. Gen XB is somebody like Hannah Beechler. So she came through our pop-up VR theater that we hosted at the Ace Hotel in New Orleans during Essence Fest, which was our first truly public VR event that Black Public Media hosted as part of this new initiative of, you know, educating Black creatives and, you know, somewhat doing general audience development as well within the Black community about VR. She came by and the very first piece of narrative VR she ever watched was neurospeculative Afrofeminism. And I asked her, I said, you know, have you seen VR before? And she said, I have, but we use it for previs. You know, during Black Panther, I have not watched narrative VR. I've never, you know, been exposed to narrative VR. So her background is that she went to University of Cincinnati for fashion design and Wright State University for film. And, you know, this is what I mean by, like, she's that top 5% in her field where very difficult to get access to. But again, I would love to find a way to show more people in that little tiny 5% who are Black and actively working in the film industry, whether on the executive side or the creative side, to at least expose them to VR. Because my hope is not so much that they would go off and make their own, it's that they would attach themselves to the projects of other VR makers who are not as well known as the executive producer of the project. And that's something that's not really happening right now in the Black VR community. In terms of exposure, we have two main things we've started. We started a mixer in New York City. Next year, we're going to do 3 in New York and 1 in LA. And basically, we set up 4 to 6 chairs. We show 1 to 3 pieces of VR, and then we have a conversation afterward. Sometimes the maker might be there, and sometimes they might not. Then I just, you know, moderate the conversation. Like when we did our VR documentaries night, we showed Grenfell, the 15-minute Grenfell piece. Has anybody seen that? That was done by Channel 2. Yeah, it's a really, really well done piece and manages to do what a lot of traditional documentaries and news reports have not been able to do, which is humanize the Grenfell survivors in a way that moves beyond like the tags of like immigrant and illegal and all this type of stuff. And 2 other pieces, and we had a really robust conversation afterward, you know, about it, like which pieces worked well as VR, which did not, you know. The other way that we're doing exposure is what we call pop-up theaters, which is showing people VR without the conversation. Just setting up, you know, 5 to 10 chairs somewhere and just, it's like, you know, a factory, just getting them through, people in and out of the seats as fast as possible and answering all their questions. Some people have a lot of questions. Some people are like, oh, wow, that was cool, and they're on their merry way. But the point of it is just exposure. So when the pieces that we've settled on that we are kind of our go-tos are neurospeculative Afrofeminism. We found a delightful 2-minute Hamilton piece that's super old, which is dead simple, but it's just really well done and people love it. And then Dinner Party, which is a narrative, it's like a 12-minute piece, I think. It's a narrative piece. Who's seen Dinner Party? Raise your hand. Okay, so we have that on headsets as well for anybody who's interested in seeing that. So here are some issues that we've run into as we've embarked on this educational initiative. So as I was asking for certain things from people in the industry, my peers, they would say to me, oh, you should ask the VR AR industry, association, Lisa. And I was like, okay. So I went to their website and I would poke around trying to find various things. Like we wanted to license 2 pieces of content to use as our go-to educational VR pieces, right? And I was like, I would love to see some VR contracts. Like maybe there's one online at this VR AR association since they're the membership organization for the industry, supposedly. And they have 18 to 19,000 members and 4,000 organizations represented as members. And I was like, yeah, surely there'll be publicly available resources here for me to tap into. I was sadly mistaken. For example, they have a legal committee or a subcommittee, and when I went to contact them, it's a generic email address, and I emailed them and said, hey, I'm trying to, I work at a nonprofit, we're trying to do educational VR screenings, I would love to, could you please could you please forward this email to the legal committee and have them be in touch with me, because I'm looking for sort of the equivalent of like Creative Commons, VR licensing agreements that I could use as an educational organization. And the response I got was, are you a member? And I was like, no. So this happened twice, 2 separate incidents over probably separated by maybe 8 weeks or something like that. And so the reason I'm not a member is that the membership cost for nonprofits is $4,500 a year. Okay? I pointed out to them in 2 very polite emails that their membership fees were wildly just crazy compared to other tech and entertainment professional organizations. So see, if I try to join as an individual, is $500. If I join as Black Public Media, is $4,500. This is what it costs at other organizations. So I was a TV Academy member for all 9 years I was in, LA. TV Academy charges you $200, and on top of that, you have to get 2 referrals from other industry peers to vet that you actually are legit to even get into the organization. So that's their $500 fee is, more than 100% higher than, an organization that gives out Emmys. SIGGRAPH is $45 a year, which I was shocked that it was that low. The highest one I found was Producers Guild. Their annual fee for the sort of professional tier, because they offer 2 other tiers for like junior producers or entry-level producers, is $425, but they have like a $25 application fee and then a $750 one-time charge, kind of like a country club, initiation. But every year after that, it would be $425. And so even that was like, that's still only whatever $775 plus $425 is. I don't do math, but it's still a lot lower than $4,500. And so, yeah, they eventually said, well, how much can you pay? And they offered me, I said like $250, and they're like, okay. And I still didn't join, because for me, it's really about the principle of the thing. It's like, you're trying to shut me up by admitting me, and you're not addressing the core issue, which is that this price point is completely out of line for anybody that's not a research university, a VC-funded startup.
It's out of line for research universities.
But it's like, it just makes no sense. I said, if you're a high school art teacher, how are you supposed to pay that? I work at a 6/7-person, 40-year-old nonprofit. How am I supposed to go to my boss and say, I want to join this thing for $4,500? Like, that's crazy sauce, So, oh my God, it's already been 45 minutes. So I'll quickly run through these since other things that I've encountered, let's put it that way. Access to VR equipment for non-students, places to rent VR cameras and VR edit suites. They do not publicly exist in New York City. Basically, you can rent VR equipment, I learned, from some of the arcades or type organizations. There's 2 in New York City. There's one that's like a 3-story massive space called VR World in Midtown, and then in Lower East Side, there's a really charming, more arty space called Jump in the Light. So we rented equipment from them to do our big conference in April. But it's not like it's a competitive space. You see what I'm saying? There's a place that rents computers, so I had to like rent the VR equipment from one place, rent the computers to plug the Rift into from another place, and so it got to be a little bit ridiculous. And then as I talked to filmmakers, they explained that once you become interested in VR, the minute you graduate from a school, you are shut out of, access to like the equipment lab or any type of equipment rentals. There's no like, oh, you're an alumni, so then you still get access to come rent, this 360 camera for a day for whatever rate. And you definitely don't get access to the edit suites anymore. Like some of the people I talked to said, friends were sneaking them into university edit suites in order for them to edit their VR. Another thing that's lacking is access to VR equipment for nonprofits and educational orgs that want to educate their communities, their students, their members. So that's the situation that I'm in. We ultimately have started to solve that problem by just buying Oculus Go's once those became available in May. But when I started the job in February, that device did not exist. And there was no device at a 200 or 250 price point that would have been appropriate for me to invest in. We were getting loaned equipment from Samsung VR, who are lovely to work with. But for me to invest, like, this is a chair of VR, this is a screening chair, the headset, I can get that on Amazon for like $79. The headphones I can get for $45 at Best Buy. But the phone is $800 new or $500 used off Amazon or other platforms. I do not have $1,000 to spend per person to show VR. That budget does not exist. And I suspect that for high schools, small to medium-sized museums, and other professional organizations that would have an interest in exposing their members, students, or community members to VR, also do not have $1,000 per chair. So the fact that now there are untethered headset options that are below a $300 price point, we're getting closer to what I would call like reasonable expenditures, where you can go to your supervisor and say, I want to spend $1,000 on VR headsets, and that's 4 headsets. Suddenly you're in business in terms of being able to show a good amount of people VR at the same time, so you can have a discussion or a class or whatever afterward, after they've all watched the same piece of content, which is key. Discounts for VR equipment don't exist, apparently, unless I'm buying like 500 headsets or 1,000 headsets at a time or something obnoxious. If I only want to buy like 5 or 10, no one can even explain to me, hey, point me to a forum online on their company website, or tell me the name of a person who's the lead on educational sales or nonprofit sales for VR equipment. The industry is not there yet. Like, it's just not a priority. They have set up no pathways for that to happen. Low-cost classes about VR. Most of the classes that I've researched, and I've researched a ton at this point, range from $300 to $2,000. Again, for Black independent filmmakers making, documentaries, that is not an investment. You're not going to spend $300 on something like that. You'd spend $300 on a new lens for your DSLR. You're not going to spend $300 on, you have a faint curiosity about a new thing. You would spend $75 for a weekend workshop. Like, I call it the UCLA extension class price. I don't see any UCLA extension class prices. What I see are $500 weekend workshops and things like that, which to me is like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Places to view VR for free or for a small fee versus what seems to be becoming more readily available are game-based experiences and location-based experiences like The Void. To me, it's like, if you're a narrative storyteller or a documentary storyteller or a journalist, you want to see examples of that content that isn't just you moving your mouse on your laptop watching 360 videos. And it's really hard to get access to that content if you don't have the headsets, unless you're spending money to go to the A-list film festivals and A-list conferences, which is, again, a big cash outlay for you to go to a Sundance. That's, minimum probably $1,000 to $2,000 for a five-day trip plus a pass. I mean, the credential is $250, including the service charge when you buy it early period. Now it's gone up to $300 for the thing, and when you add in the service charge, it's $350. So it's like, again, if you're an independent filmmaker, you're just trying to educate yourself about something, how are you supposed to, or a teacher, or a museum curator, or a university administrator, or if you're the person who supervises university staff, and you're like, I need to train these 5 professors, or instructors, or administrators about VR, how can I show them a bunch of stuff at one time? Are you really going to spend $600 for a film festival pass for 10 people at a time, plus the expense of sending them to the festival? I'm not sure. Publicly available sample VR licensing contracts, including a legal definition of VR. If anybody has a legal definition of VR, please email it to me. We're writing contracts right now. I need one. I can't find any examples. So. And lastly, publicly available data about industry licensing fees. Like, I really wish that studios would start submitting their licensing information, and also that independent makers would also submit their licensing information into anonymous database, so that we can start to aggregate that information and start to see what's being paid for what. You know what I mean? I think that would really help, again, small organizations like ours who want to put our toe into the water, but there's just no guidance, and everybody, it's just like nobody will talk. Nobody. Like, you could have super awesome friends at a VR studio, and you say, hey, can you send me some redacted contracts, or can you, give me some numbers, a range. You don't even have to tell me the specific amount. Just give me a range. Like, low end, you spend this per minute versus this, you spend this per minute. No information is forthcoming. So I feel like that's an opportunity, plus the legal issue is a real opportunity for certain schools like an MIT or let's say a USC that have robust VR departments and VR research going on, but also have like a law school where that then become, and maybe even a film school where it's like, there's got to be collaborations that can happen at the grad school level where, the rising, emerging filmmakers who are coming out of a certain school get paired up with the, law students as their legal advisors, and that basically those contracts that come out of those collaborations end up as publicly available documents, with the caveat that these are works in progress, but at least here's some examples for you and your legal team to reference as you create what's appropriate for your organization. Because like with us, we have the public media mandate, which is very different than me as being a Hulu or Netflix or Oculus signing a contract for a piece of VR.
I wonder though, how, as you are asking this question, how deep are you networking with other organizations within the public media system like AMDOC and ITVS?
I've asked a few people questions, yeah, and the answers I've gotten are, Lisa, I have no idea. I've been asking the same questions for over a year.
I think it's because I think what's something I want you to take ownership of is that you're doing something new for the system, and you might have to be the one to write those contracts because you're right, they don't exist.
Right.
And the process of licensing media isn't so different in VR as it should be for licensing a short.
Right.
And so you're setting the economy. So I guess, within the system.
We're dealing with a very commercialized system and a very proprietary system where people are not willing to give up their financial power.
Right.
And so, that's what that's about, really. And people aren't to the place where they can share because they feel like what they have is something that nobody's done yet, and they don't feel like they can share it. At least that's what I keep running into.
Well, I'd also say we're at a very nascent state in the
Yeah.
development of VR. It would be like saying, how much is a film? But I'm including from 8mm up to 70.
Right.
Give me a price. You can't, the variables are profound. The stuff we've developed here has been crazily erratic, going from multi-million to peanuts.
Right.
It
But
depends. It's one of those it
It
depends
totally
kind of-
depends, but the pieces, the NSAF and Dinner Party, NSAF, like, if it's a 200K budget, it's a 5-minute animated short.
By
And
the way,
then-
where did they raise the 200K?
Intel, I think, came in, I think they said like 2 weeks before Sundance. Before that, I think it had been mostly bootstrapped. So I think like Intel swooped in and saved the day, basically. Yeah. But you have to remember that was 2016 when nobody was really hardcore funding VR projects, much less like VR projects where the main character is a black woman in a sci-fi environment.
Yeah.
So, yep.
I have a quick question. It's a little bit out of the scope of this, but it's related to what's missing. So what about a conversation about getting more Black technologists on the hardware side of VR development? Because when I did NSAF, I was struck by how when I was looking in the mirror, the headset I was wearing, the hair that I was seeing wouldn't
Right.
accommodate that headset.
Right.
And I said that to Ashley. I was like, this is such a disjunct that I couldn't put headset on the hair I'm seeing, and she's
Right.
like, oh yeah, I've lost so many grades with these headsets. And so getting Black technologists in on the Oculus
Right.
side, like what conversations are going on about that and mentorship? Okay.
I don't know. That's
Yeah,
not
that's
my
not-
strength. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like we anecdotally, it comes up a lot. But I'm not a coder. My career has not focused on, coding. That I don't have a network of coders. Like I know storytellers. Like that's been
Yeah.
my sort. It's like I would love to see them hire more Black coders. You can keep holding your breath. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So. And this goes back to the gatekeeping. Like if you're only ever recruiting from the top 25 engineering schools in the country, how many Southern schools are on that list aside from Georgia Tech?
Yeah.
Like I grew up in Atlanta, so I can have this conversation.
I'm from Virginia.
So it's like,
Totally.
You're always going back to the same short list, and then I had somebody at a Fox panel say to me, well, my HR tells me that there are no candidates. They can't find people for me. And I'm like, well, that's a lie. I went to an AI talk where 10% of the room was Black and the speaker was Black. So clearly the talent is out there, they exist. I don't know why they're not reaching the hundreds of VR companies, hardware and software up and down the West Coast.
I think part of it though is where a lot of people aren't thinking, because I've been through so I have a VR piece that was partly developed and funded by Black Public Media. And so it's been 2 years and trying to sort of figure out the outrolling of it with a show that it's connected to. And like the distribution systems aren't set up and people don't know what to relate them to. So we find ourselves, we've applied to just about everything. And we've been successful in some funding approaches, but then it's like, are you, okay, like kind of like what William was saying, are you a short film? Are you a doc, right? Because in the film world, like you'd approach all of those contracts
Right.
and things differently. But I also think there's I'm at a point kind of where I'm pivoting because I've stopped looking at, I've been to the Oculus conferences, I was in Launchpad, I was in Next Gen, I got Oculus last year, done the New Frontier thing, and so I'm pivoting because I feel like we're looking towards these behemoths to like tell us what to do.
I'm not.
Or not
Yeah,
what to do in that sense.
Yeah.
I'm saying from developing some of the standards of contracts and things like that, and even distribution more specifically. So I was at Cabo Aurora's thing at the ISET he's setting up at Hopkins 2 weeks ago. And so as soon as you ask the distribution question, everyone's like, well, we don't know. But part of it, like, and you mentioned this earlier, just in an example with some of the funding, it's money's coming from these ad agencies. So then it's actually, they aren't looking for sort of a return or distribution or on distribution. So people aren't forced to think creatively about distribution. Whereas if you pivot towards looking at some of the stuff that Sundance has done around independent distribution and art house cinemas, like I feel like that's actually a much more accurate model. And so Oculus, some of the bigger companies, I don't want to name names because folks who work with a lot of those people, like once you get into the rooms where they're doing all the planning, there's such a figuring out how to like make money the quickest. And I feel like they actually aren't thinking about sort of like larger and alternative models that you've seen in other film things. And so I think it's going to be, specifically around people of color, essentially up to us to like develop that tradition for VR. I think it actually, in the nature of VR and that experience, actually it's more in tune, I feel like, with something that would come out of that cultural experience versus the gaming world, which still has a little bit of a like that Silicon Valley, like
A little bit?
bro. So like it's interesting because that's even pivoting though when you look at like the increase, because we were in LA 2 years ago, we were protesting Snapchat because they came in and they basically like kind of destroyed our neighborhood. But like that culture is shifting too as you get like more immigrant focusing coming in. So it's actually, a lot of people keep saying like young white men, but then you go there and like white men are the minority in terms of like the at least like sort of biological, or not biological, diversity makeup, ethnic and
But you're talking about end user, not maker.
No, I'm talking about the people who are making and setting the standards for where we think the industry should
Okay,
go.
because when I think of this, what I'm trying to accomplish is that Black people will make their own VR companies and own the stuff from day one. Not that they are looking for internships and grants and things from white-owned companies that will never, ever, ever hire them from day one to be an owner. Like, getting options when you get hired as a senior whatever or a VP of whatever is not the same as being one of the first 15 through the door. It will never, ever, ever be the equivalent of that. And so until we have a media industry or a wave, like, you know, because what we've been doing as a country is continuing to follow, you know, newspapers, book publishing, radio, TV, film, like, they've all followed the same pattern of culture creation, you know, where Black people get invited to be the talent or in front of the screen or to make the content, but they never actually own the content, and they don't own the platforms for distribution, and they don't own the companies. And so the wealth is not created in those communities where then you can have a PayPal mafia that's like 100% Black or 80% Black that then goes on to invest in other Black makers and other people of color and their ideas and have it ripple out, because we keep following the same pattern. You know what I mean? So that's what I ultimately would like to see in like the next 50 years, is that one of these, you know, the last big burst we had like this of culture creation was the social media explosion in the aughts. And before that it was, or not the aughts, the mid-90s, excuse me, like when YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter were all invented within like 3 years of each other. And I lived through the dot-com boom. So I've lived through this now like 3 times, because video games started becoming popular when I was like a 5th grader, you know, when Pong was invented and stuff like that, and people actually started buying gaming systems for their kids, and the kids actually started requesting the gaming systems. We have not reached that period yet with VR. And then the dot-com boom happened, and then the social media boom happened. And so I'm like, gaming is a $1 billion industry. It makes more money at this point than the film industry. I think it dwarfs the film industry, if I remember correctly. And, you know, here we are again, and it's like we're still trying to mimic the old models and the entrenched powers, you know, who control culture across so many different platforms and so many different, just so many different ways, are rolling it out in the only way they know how to, or that is a priority for them. So the question is, like, to your point, I am not trying to go to them for stuff. Let's just put it that way. Like, to me, this is about creating a separate initiative that is in parallel, that hopefully spawns its own thing, while mainstream, you know, white-owned capitalism continues to make culture in the way that it has made culture for the last, you know, 150 years, basically.
I'm gonna push back against that. Like, I mean, and this is to preface, they funded our project, so I'm not sort of challenging in the sense of challenging.
And by the way, I'm speaking as me, not as Black public media.
Okay.
I'm speaking as Lisa Osborne.
Okay.
Yeah, like
So,
that's my view, as like, I think you can have 5 billion Oculus launch pads. I don't think it will create an ecosystem of Black makers in the VR industry.
So I'm saying
Yeah.
that I know, and I am one of many of the Black makers that are out there. And so we aren't waiting on those things. I didn't get money for any of them. I went to all of their conferences, and then you don't get any money. That's why I said I was pivoting from it. What's starting to, like, honestly, and people here at MIT, the open doc space probably knows about me, but I'm getting a little, like, I feel like we're having this conversation more than we're, and this isn't to you, this is about our industry, more than we're doing it. So, like, me and Kamala, we were at the Library of Congress thing, then the next day we went to Gabo's thing, and so then I think I've seen Kamal at like 8, it's Kamal Sinclair from Sungance, about 8 different times around the year, and I was like, between us and our email list, we have a distribution system. And so we'll have 100 conferences on the need to, like, increase diversity and to challenge Oculus and but between MIT and Hopkins and USC and Sundance and Tribeca, like, we reach enough people for there to be a thing. So we're constantly, like, calling for a thing and spending more time and energy and resources to have conferences asking for a thing. I feel like then we are coming together to utilize our own existing resources and infrastructures to create the thing that we're calling for. So, like, I've been getting invited to various conferences, and I'm like, I don't need to go to another conference about.
Yeah, but you
and
have
I'm
to-
not saying this in the context of you again.
Yeah, but you have to remember that you have been in this space for a long time, i.e. probably 3 years. This space is still extremely new, and for Black people, it's new. So even though you and Kamal are old heads at this point, same here. Like, you have to remember you live in a bubble. Your understanding of the technology, your awareness of the technology, you live in a bubble. You are 1 out of a million. You understand? So it's like your frustration is based on the fact that you've been in that space for so long that you are now worn out by these conversations and the lack of movement. But my point is, it will take another 100 of those conferences in order to make even a smidgen of a dent in this issue within the existing spaces and power structures that
And
exist.
so I guess I 100% agree with that. And so, but I'm also saying our conferences are part of the power structure, right? Like having a conference.
Whose
we bring someone
conference?
together.
My conference? Whose
No,
conference?
not your conference. I'm talking
Yeah.
about like in our industry. So what I'm saying is like, even if we think of like, say you go to, when I'm totally in the bubble, I'm totally privileged to be at a lot of these spaces. So say you're on the going around to the 10 events or whatever, I think I've probably been to in a year. And so what I'm actually almost looking at is like from a financial standpoint of even the money to run those 10 events, to talk about power structures. In a way, we're stepping aside from our own power as a community of people who value these particular things. And I'm not saying this in contrast to what you're saying, I'm saying in addition to, part of what's missing is a conversation about how those people in those communities and those institutions that already value these things, how do we sort of step aside from the traditional, we're gonna make an RFP, you're gonna apply for these things, we're gonna fund X projects, then figure out, okay, let's start building in the inroads.
But that would require them to disrupt their own business model, which is not going to happen, and their own cultural training that they've had since birth in this country. You see what I'm saying? Like,
You don't think that's a shorter road, or at least inventing another lane, than trying to challenge the larger power structure of how an Oculus is trying to operate, given we know what their values are because they're Facebook?
I'm saying that it's not that whether it's shorter or longer. My point is that it won't happen because you're asking for a multinational corporation or even a really large startup to somehow disrupt itself and its way of business. And that would require every single person or enough people, or maybe just thought leaders within that company who actually have power, to somehow disrupt their own way of thinking of business and what makes a business successful and what are the metrics for success for a business. Because the current metrics for success deem that you get to a return on investment for your investors, which needs to be 8 to 10 times return, as fast as possible. You cannot accomplish that, goes the thinking, what they've been trained to do in business school and other places, by disrupting yourself in a way that includes a whole bunch of new parties and players in the ecosystem that currently are not there in any significant numbers at all.
So I want to.
You know what I mean? Like,
I
so,
100% understand.
yeah.
I'm saying, but even just
Yeah,
in that
like-
moment, you pivoted to talking about Oculus and businesses. I'm talking about MIT and Tribeca and Sundance.
Those are
And so
businesses.
we are the institution.
Those are
usually
businesses.
nonprofit run though, that even though we have our corporate structure.
You're asking for somebody like Ford Foundation to disrupt itself, is what I'm saying, or Sundance Institute, or American Film Institute. Like, that's not going to happen. You might believe it will happen, but I'm saying my opinion is that will not happen. That type of disruption takes either some sort of like outside disaster to happen to trigger it, you know, or whether that's an act of God that happens in the culture at large, like breakdown of government or something like that, or an external source coming in and forcing change because, let's say, you decide that Google or Facebook is so big they need to be broken up into baby bells. You see what I'm saying? That is not going to happen without some outside force or an internal structure or some type of act of God. Like, I just don't see, those things are so big at this point, like big research universities. Things like that of that size don't disrupt themselves. And again, it goes back to what I'll call the way we were all raised in terms of what you're taught from day one as to what the metrics of success are for any venture, whether it's a for-profit venture or a not-for-profit venture. So I want to wrap up the presentation, but thank you for your comments. So this basically summarizes all the things we've said before. How's a independent filmmaker supposed to get access limited pathways to for people to gain access to tools and resources, which is what we're talking about, and who's educating the educators about VR. Because what I'm trying to get at is that how will a tipping point ever happen if key hubs in the network lack information and resources that they need in order to help it become mainstream? You're not going to become mainstream just by selling devices through commercial outlets and showing things at high-end film festivals and conferences. There's got to be other pathways for things to become the information to get out. You see what I'm saying? Or the knowledge to get out. And so these hubs, whether it's a research university, a liberal arts college, a 1,400 person high school, a small regional museum, a 40-year-old nonprofit, we are all gatekeepers. You see what I'm saying? And so it's like the hubs are the gatekeepers. They need this information. They need all the resources that I just listed on the previous slides. And so that's not happening right now. And again, because of this thinking, the way that we've all been trained to think of what are the metrics of success for a startup business, and to gain scale, that word that people like to throw around so much, and the way you gain scale is a certain way that's tried and true. It does not involve disrupting who the participants are, and it does not involve focusing on penny ante to them, people like small and mid-sized museums, curators, educators, brown people, things like that. And so that's what I'm getting at. Now I'm gonna, in 5 minutes, run through everything we did this year, just so you see visuals. These are all our VR activations that we did. We kicked off with our internal conference in April, which was held at Google. I did a 10-seat activation, showed, I believe, like 5 VR pieces and 1 AR piece, the AR piece that was in development. Then we kicked off our public activations with our pop-up VR theater during Essence Fest in New Orleans over the 4th of July weekend. We showed about 100 people VR, and out of that, only 5 of them had ever seen VR before, and out of those 5, only 3 of them were Black. So that's sort of where we are. Harlem Week Youth Conference and Hackathon was in August in New York City. We went to Williamsburg Charter High School's 9th grade orientation out in Brooklyn. We did a public screening in conjunction with a public screening of the documentary Whose Streets that POV had acquired, a film organization in Harlem called Imagination. They did a joint outdoor screening, and Black Public Media did a pop-up VR theater at the same event. We did monthly mixer at New Lab, which is a 500-member co-working space in Brooklyn that basically focuses on emerging tech and tech startups. So it's like us trying to make friends with people who are coders and have skill sets that our filmmakers would need. We went to their anniversary party, which was our biggest activation for the year. Their party attracted 3,000 people last year. This year it looked like they were pretty much on by 9 p.m., which was an hour before the party ended. I think they said they checked in 2,900 people or something like that. We had a waiting list outside of like 45 minutes to an hour to watch VR. We eventually just had to close the line. And I'd say probably 20 to 30% of the people who came through were Black out of the line, and they were all just delighted, including a New York Times journalist and a woman who works for a VR company who had never heard of us, had no idea there was a Black VR mixer in New York, was delighted. Didn't even know that Black people were like really making narrative VR. Like, she was just excited, and when she saw NSAF, she was as well like, oh my God, this is amazing, this is so wonderful. So she was really happy. 20th Century Fox, their Inclusion Week in Los Angeles, that was the comment that I mentioned about the senior executive saying, well, my HR person tells me that they can't find anybody. Loyola Marymount Mixer, the same week, where we had maybe 15 VR filmmakers come. Really amazing event. I mean, the event was supposed to be like 3 hours, and I basically kicked people like out. I was like, we have to go at 11:30 at night outside. And so I'm really looking forward to going back to LA and trying to figure out ways to help the filmmakers there, who seem to be about 3 years ahead of the East Coast pretty much is what we learned that weekend, during that trip. It was kind of shocking. And then Brooklyn Navy Yard's annual mixer, which we just did in October. Here are some photos of what it looks like when we basically do our pop-up theaters. This is at the Youth Hackathon. These are a bunch of high school kids. This is at Essence Festival in the music venue in the lobby of the hotel. This is at one of our mixers. We work out of WeWork Harlem. We do not have an office, and so most of our staff works remotely. Another one of our mixers at WeWork Harlem. You see that a lot of the photos have our loaner headsets that Samsung and its PR company provide to us. They've been a really good partner all year. So I just want you to think through, since we already had a pretty robust discussion, as you do your work. In addition to us, which other organizations in this presentation are actually gatekeepers? And now you kind of understand that gatekeeping can be something like setting a membership fee way too high. So it's like, who provides training, who provides funding, who grants access to a space, who grants access to content, who grants access to interviews or auditions, who has access to a particular group, whether that's a professional networking group, a union, a community like ours, which is more, loose. Who grants access to certain events, whether it's film festivals that screen VR or high-end conferences that screen VR. Who provides distribution and who provides exhibition. Here's my contact information. Does anybody have any last questions before we wrap? Thank you so much. This was great.